Hey, everybody, welcome back to the Mosaic Podcast. This is a fun time. I am going to meet the person that we're talking to today, just almost like you're meeting him. I've had another conversation. A friend of mine introduced us, but we don't really know each other all that well. I know this about him, that the little that I do know about him, I love. He is a good man and a kind man, and the work that he does is really helping to connect people and help people make connections to live a life where their spirit and their integrity and their business all grow together. He is the creator, founder, force behind a company called Awarepreneurs. And they do what I said just a moment ago. They focus on the needs of conscious business owners and social entrepreneurs to maintain their spiritual integrity and their personal integrity. I want to read you something that was at the bottom of an email that he sent me. Your soul is saying, it's time to impact the world in a new way. You want to know how to help more people and have your body of work leave a more significant legacy. You are ready to say yes to stepping into your role as a thought leader. And you know you need to step up your conscious marketing. It is my honor today to welcome you, a friend of mine, Paul, to a friend of mine, which is the community of Mosaic people. Paul Zelizer, welcome to the Mosaic Podcast.
Henny, thank you so much for having me. It's such an honor to be here.
It's my treat. Because we're time crunched, let's just jump right into it, okay? Tell me what your parents did when you were growing up.
In terms of like for a livelihood?
Yeah. How did you grow? What environment did you grow up in?
Yeah, so it's kind of biblical, so to speak. I'm the oldest son of a Jewish accountant. Grew up in the Hudson Valley, New York, in the suburbs of New York. I was born in New York City, but it was part of white flight, moved to the suburbs, and grew up in the Hudson Valley in New York to a Jewish accountant and a Jewish school teacher who moved to the suburbs and kind of were upwardly mobile. One of the only Jewish families in a moderately Republican East Coast New York City white suburb with some of the best public schools in America and a lot of privilege and a lot of ways it didn't make sense to my nervous system. Like, what's going on here and how come I don't make sense here? So that's what it was like.
So what about it didn't make sense?
I like to tell this story. When I was 9 years old, my dad was I like to joke I had two dads. I had the dad I had growing up, and the same dad had a kind of a spiritual crisis and became a hospice social worker, and we all changed.
Wow.
So I had two dads. But the dad I had growing up was...
Excuse me, let me clarify. You had two dads or two versions of the same dad?
I had dad 1.0 and dad 2.0,
Okay.
who both had the same name and the same social security number, but there was such an upgrade that they were not the same product.
I understand. Yeah. Okay, just wanted to be clear.
So when I was 9 years old, my dad was a tax accountant, and he was putting on a suit and getting ready to go in on a Saturday morning to this job that he didn't like, but paid the bills. And I remember trying to, I hadn't seen him much. It was tax season and he was an accountant, and it was now Saturday. And I was like, why? Explain this thing to me. I mean, that's this thing being a tie and a suit and this job and going into work on a Saturday morning when you haven't seen your family. This thing was a big question, but it literally got interpreted as the tie. And he said to me, I know it doesn't make sense now, but when you're older, you'll wear one of these too.
Wow.
And I said, nah, right? And again, it was the whole gestalt of what life was like. I could feel he wasn't happy and it wasn't meaningful. And he was doing it from a place of wanting to be a good man and a family man and take care of his family. And he was an incredible provider. And he was also miserable and wasn't very much fun to be around. And I didn't want that.
Wow.
And that's what I saw. The men in my orbit mostly weren't very happy, were very stressed, were working themselves very hard, but didn't have much aliveness or sense of that life was a beautiful thing. And
Wow.
I had some embodied experience that life was a gift, and I didn't want to live that way.
And this is already at 9 years old?
Yeah.
So what experience did you have at 9 years old that allowed you to experience that experience? Because that's outrageous that a 9-year-old would.
I didn't have vocabulary. I didn't know what was,
Right.
but
I understand.
my little being knew something was off here.
Got it.
It's a great question. I can't explain it. I don't know. I saw it in my daughter. I think we're all born with an innate intelligence and wisdom. And in many cultures that's welcomed and cultivated. And in many modern cultures that isn't. So I actually don't think that it's that unique for a 9-year-old to be asking big questions that they don't have words for, but have a felt sense. And what felt unique to me is, or what felt off to me is like, why are when we all talking? Why don't we relate this? Why?
Right.
What's wrong? Like, of course humans relate this way.
Right. So there's a story that I remember someone told me years and years ago about their children. And they had a child, and the child was just a happy kid. And then they got pregnant and had a second child. And when the second child came, the first child, who was this happy-go-lucky kid, turned into this complete monster. And they had to watch him because he would try and beat up the baby. And so they did a lot of work with him around what was going on. And they bought a one of those systems where it's a microphone for the room that you can hear what's going on, and you can tune in. It's an intercom. Intercom is the word I was looking for. And he said to his parents, "I just have to be with the baby alone." And they said, that's hard for us because you haven't been very kind to him when you've been alone. And he said, "I know, I promise you I'll be kind, but I just need to be alone." And they said, "Wait a minute." And they went in and they turned on the intercom and they turned up the volume so that they could be right at the door if, they saw him trying to kill him or heard it, because they were actually genuinely concerned he might. And they said, "Okay, go on in." And he went in and he sat close. They could feel him being close to the crib. And he said, "You have to help me remember. You have to help me remember what it's like. I've forgotten. I've been here so long and it pisses me off so much. You have to help me remember where you came from." So it wasn't for me that I found it miraculous, incredulous that at 9 years old you had that. I found it more incredulous that by 9 years old you still had it, the world hadn't sucked it out of you.
Yeah. My mom likes to tell this story. When I was in first grade, that's a beautiful story. I love that story.
Yeah.
Thank you. When I was in first grade, we were doing a unit on transportation. And the teacher stood up in front of the class and said, "Okay, class, now we're doing a unit on transportation. Let's start with everybody raise your hand and talk about a way you could travel." Somebody little Johnny raised his hand and said, "You could drive in a car." And Susie raised her hand and said, "You could fly on an airplane." And somebody said, "You could fly on a boat." And little Paul in first grade raised his hand and said, "You could ride on the back of a dolphin."
Wow.
And the teacher threw me out of the class, sent me to the principal's office, and was convinced I was trying to undermine what was happening in the class. And my mom, fortunately, I would say, my mom came in and she was furious, furious that the teacher couldn't accept that Paul. So I think some of it is, even though there was some challenges growing up in the way I grew up, I also had that as well. That all right, Paul's a little bit of an out of the box thinker, but like, you're not gonna like target my kid as a troublemaker because he genuinely is like you. And needless to say, then the new age world started doing dolphin swim at the dolphin tours for 3,000. Paul was just a spiritual entrepreneur at
Yeah.
first grade, and my mom somehow and was able to welcome that I'm a little bit out of the box and can't just say you should fly in an airplane or you should ride on a train. It, I don't understand this brain sometimes, but I've always had that a little bit out of the box way of being, Dan.
It's really interesting because when you say that story, it reminds me when I was a kid, I had my closest friend that I played with all the time. Um, I decided I was going to bring him back home and introduce him to my mom. And I brought him back home and I said, Mom, I want you to meet this is my best friend. I play with him all the time. And she looked at me and she said, Danny, there's nobody there.
Mm.
I said, what do you mean there's nobody there? He's right here. You can't see him. She
Mm.
said, Danny, please never tell that story to anybody else. They'll think you're crazy.
Mm.
And I stayed with my friend for some time, but then I put him aside until he started to come back again now later in my life where I don't really care what people think. But
Mm.
that little friend, the childhood imagination is fascinating. But in your case, what really also seems to be, and correct me, I'm just lobbing this over the net, correct me if it's not correct. It seems that that imprint that you had of as a kid of the tie, which by the way, for people who are not watching the video of this, Paul is not wearing a tie, as you can well imagine.
Oh, darn, I forgot it. I'm so
So
sorry, Danny.
I told you, Paul, wear that tie.
Dang.
So, but that imprint that was left in you of the tie and your dad's unhappiness and your dad and the transformation and version 2.0 of dad, did that really set the stage for you to do what you're doing now?
Oh gosh. Here's what I'll tell you. Here's what set the stage. When I was 17 years old, I woke up after a pretty bad binge with drugs and alcohol. I had gone pretty far down that rabbit hole. And a very wise woman who was a family friend, we sat down together. And she said something that changed the trajectory of my life, or maybe returned me to a certain path. I don't quite know what to say. Maybe both. She said, Paul, here's the deal. You are wired for poignant experiences. You're wired for poignant experiences. And this goes one of two ways. You either have a lifetime of drama and addiction and quite possibly die young, or there are these things called awareness practices, and they'll help you cultivate this like really rich, poignant, meaningful life. And there's a lot of them. She wasn't trying to, the thing that landed for me is she wasn't trying to recruit me for her brand of spirituality.
Right.
She really had nothing but the genuine care of trying to explain my own nervous system to me so I could live a happy life.
Yeah.
And I heard her. She said, you know, there's many different awareness practices. I don't care which one you choose. Just choose one, please. You'll live a good life and you'll be of service to other people and you'll be happy. And at 17 years old, I heard her.
And so did she then sit with you and sort of um, share with you some of those practices, or did she leave you to go out on your own and find them, or how did
My
you?
mom had already been on a spiritual, she knew I was surrounded by people. No, she just, you know, she asked me if I had any questions, but it was a very short but very poignant conversation. And she did it masterfully. She didn't try to coach me. She didn't try to steer me in a direction. She just wanted me to understand my own nervous system. And that sent me on a, you know, I was 17. I'm not, for those of you who are, again, not seeing the video, I've got some white hairs. I've earned every one of these white hairs in my beard, right? It sent me off on a lifetime of journeying, and the quest to be of service. So many spiritual paths talk about living a life of service as being a key to happiness. And I heard that through line despite having, explored many different paths. I kept hearing whether it was yoga or my own Jewish roots or contemplative Christianity or Buddhism. So many traditions are pointing in the direction of a life of service as being the foundation of being happy. And when we're done here, feeling like it's been a meaningful journey on planet Earth. And I
Perfect.
try to figure that out. How do you do work that understands that kind of fundamental truth across tradition?
Let me rewind a little bit. And I want people who are listening to really listen to see if we can flush out something here. That moment when, was it an aunt that you said? Who was this woman?
She's a family friend.
Family friend. That moment when that family friend saw you, 17 years old, um, caught between the direction of drugs and alcohol and the possibility of walking down a road that could have been um, dramatic and short termed, and that moment where there were poignant experiences that would have nothing to do with drugs and alcohol, but that would far surpass the experience of those experiences. That sensitive moment where she didn't try to convert you to the way she thought, but she just lobbed it over the net for you to deal with.
Mm.
Can you dive into that moment? Because there's so many people that are listening here
Mm.
that feel that feeling, but don't do it that way.
Mm.
I would like to unpack that moment for it to the best that you can.
Yeah. It's a great question. I'm sitting with that, Teddy. Well, part of what was going on is I had just had this challenging experience. Was feeling really bad, both physically bad from imbibing having so many of these substances in my body and hangover, and also having done things while under the influence that I felt a lot of shame about.
Yeah.
Um, so I was in a certain receptive, like, yeah, this is not who I'm put on this planet to be. And yeah, she was also just, she was a she was a wisdom keeper type person who knew how to sense that and knew just enough that if she pushed in too hard or tried to drag me by the ear into something that wasn't the right fit for me, she was gonna miss that opportunity. She just like knew, yeah. So it was some combination of I was just in a receptive place out of pain and suffering, and she was very attuned and skillful to what I could or couldn't take in, and I could only take in a very little bit, which I think part of the reason it was so crisp.
Yeah. So again, and if we can't go any deeper on this, then it's fine. I have an amazing curiosity about moments,
Yeah.
pivotal moments that change a person's life,
Yeah.
and understanding those moments and flushing them out. Like everything you're saying makes complete sense. And most people would say, that's great, thank you, because she was sensitive enough to just say just the smallest amount. But what was it about her demeanor? What was it? Because I'm sure other people said to you, Paul, this isn't, you're heading down a road that might
Yeah.
might give you a short life. And but you didn't hear those people. And maybe it's just the course of time that just enough people, like the straw that broke the camel's
Right,
back, right?
right,
But I
right.
have a sense in the way you tell the story that there was something in her, something in the way she was, something in the
Mm.
way you received from her, that if we could learn that. Right now we live in a world where people are telling each other what to do all the time.
Yeah.
That would be a gem that we could leave people on this podcast with, that would be immeasurable in value.
It's a beautiful question, Danny. So her demeanor, what was about her demeanor? There was something about both uh, a fierceness
Hmm.
Not a self-interested one, but like, I don't know how many examples we have in the West, but I can think, think of Kali or somebody like, a fierce
Yeah.
spiritual female presence
Yeah.
combined with a genuine compassion of trying to help me understand. It's like, imagine you saw a teenager driving in such a way that could get them and other people killed.
Yeah.
Like I was literally operating this human in a way that was going to hurt
Yeah.
myself
Yeah.
badly or somebody else badly or both. And that sense of like, pay attention here. You're going to do severe harm with, I care about you and I don't want you to have that road. I don't want you to continue down this road, both for other people's well-being and your own. And there was something in that I guess, so your question was demeanor. It was fierceness combined with compassion, combined with she wasn't she wasn't trying to sell me a solution. And I could
Yeah.
feel that. I was waiting for the sell. You should convert to
Right.
Christianity. You should
Right.
come to my guru. You should do this kind of meditation because the kind of meditation you're doing isn't is inferior. There was none, zero self-interest, and very high in both the confrontation or fierceness and very high in the compassion and then the love. And that combination, those three things together would be how I would
Wow.
describe her demeanor.
I love that. And so, what I'm going to invite the listeners to do now is use Paul's incidents here as a way to touch base with one of your incidences. Find a pivotal point in your life where something happened for you, where somebody who you least expected or most expected, it doesn't matter. That's not important who it was. But how did they land? How did the information they presented land in you? What was it about them? Because so often the lessons we learn are not the lessons that are there for us to learn. It's not in the words that they say, but it's the story behind it. It's the things that we don't take notice of that are the most noticeable. I was talking to somebody the other day, and he was just such a he was a great salesperson, but that was his strength and it was just his weakness. I felt like slimy from talking to him, and he, he he told me of
I
this.
think I met that guy last week.
Maybe, right? And he told me of these people that he went to see that changed his entire scope of being. That he went in as complete skeptic and walked away a complete disciple of what they were doing. And I asked him what it was, and he said, they just did it like similar to the question I'm asking you. And he said they just did it with a love of the heart that was totally with concern with my benefit at stake, but no push to it at all. And I said, so what did you learn from that? Like, here you are, the biggest skeptic. What did you learn? Like, why not practice what they practice? Because like you're trying to sell people and you're selling them away from what you're doing, right? So it's often in the things that aren't said that if we take time to slow it down. So I appreciate you like diving into it a moment more.
Well, that's it. No, you taught me something in terms of staying with the moment and minding it beyond just the first level. So yeah, because as you know, I have a podcast and I ask a lot of questions, but I'm thinking, wow, have I ever dug in 2 or 3 times,
Yeah.
peeling back a layer? And I'm not sure I ever have. And I'm like, oh, how cool is that? So you just
Yeah.
taught me something, Danny. Thank you.
Thank you. It's my honor to be in this process of learning with each other. Um, so how did what you do, like, I'm not so concerned with what happened. How did it answer up a need in you that what you created? Because so often I think the things that we create in the world are the things we need for ourselves.
Yeah.
I don't know if you agree with that. First of all, do you agree with that? And if you do, then how did it fill up a need that you have?
I've had some great mentors in my life, just fabulous mentors. And one of them, a man named Stephen Botkin. And Stephen taught me about a concept called enlightened self-interest. that there's always some level of self-interest in something, and we get ourselves in trouble when we pretend, oh, I'm doing this entirely for the good of humanity
Right.
and there's nothing in it for me whatsoever. Yeah, that's probably not a thing, right?
Right.
So yes, I did. That's a long way to say I do agree, although I do agree. I would also add the nuance that pure self-interest is that I don't. I think there is a thing called enlightened self-interest where my own needs and desires can come into deep alignment with what other people and what the world needs. And that's where things are really interesting for me. At my worst, I certainly have operated from pure self-interest, nothing enlightened or expanded or aware about it, right? So I think there's a continuum on how much we're able to be skillful in our needs and our desires and how they get woven into what we're bringing into the world. I don't think we're humans, we're bundles of needs and desires,
Yeah.
right? Do we ever turn that off? I haven't found the off button, and mostly the people who tell me they have are people that have done some
Yeah.
horrific things. So I think it's more a matter of how do we be awake and skillful with our desires and our needs. And so, yeah, certainly, I think the most honest, simplest question is the world's a mess. I'm deeply concerned about the world that we're passing on to our children and our grandchildren and the 7 generations. And my own sanity. I don't know how to pretend that the world's not a mess. And then I'm deeply concerned. And to have some work that feels like even begins to try to chip away at some of the mess and try to make the world a better place is part of Paul Zelizer trying to stay sane.
Yeah.
And that if I tried to be that, growing up where I grew up, my trajectory was to be a leader in one of the systems that were kind of driving us off an ecological cliff. And I would go, I would not be a well human being. I don't pretend well. And put me in a leadership seat and headed quickly down a highway of great harm to other humans and the planet. And I do not do well. So to try to find some livelihood that was in alignment of, or best case scenario, like actually furthering what my values were, want the world to look like and what we pass on. It's the single biggest gift I know of. Aligned work is, Freud said love and work, right? Meaningful relationships and work that's aligned with your values. It doesn't get much better than that.
I didn't think I was going to get Freud out of you
I
somehow,
know
but
Freud. Yeah, I have a lot of problems with Freud. He's, but love and work.
love and works. Love and
That works for
works.
me. I think he's spot on. Those are the biggest teachers in my life. Yeah.
Yeah. So I think you know or may not know, but people that have listened know that I was at Hay House for 10 years.
Okay.
Um, and I saw an interesting phenomenon. I can't say it was with everybody because I just don't want to make that statement publicly. So I'll just say it was with most of the people that came there. Um, that most of the people wrote the book they most needed to read.
Yeah.
They didn't write the book that they knew. They thought they were writing the book that they knew. But when they would come to me to speak with me, because they knew I didn't want anything from them, it turned out we kept going. I often wanted to say to them, you should just go back and read your book because your book is really beautiful in that.
I know this book. It'll really help you, and
I
you
mean,
wrote it.
it's so good, and it's helping millions of people. And I think it would be really good for you to just like pick it up and read it because it deals with exactly that issue.
Hmm.
And I thought I was so insightful until I wrote my book, The Mosaic, which, by the way, I didn't write at all. I tried to write it for 2.5 years, and it was a mess.
Yeah.
Until finally the characters, and it wasn't like a mystical experience. It's like, unless this is a mystical experience, me talking to you, I sat down and I saw them right in front of me as if I'm seeing you. And I said to them, why are you being such a pain in the butt? Like, why are you making this so hard? And they said, that's our question to you. And I said, well, what do you mean? They said, well, we don't want to say what you're telling us to say. We're telling you what we want to say, and you're changing it to what you want us to say. We want you to listen to what we say and say it.
Mm.
And what I realized is I was writing the book that I most needed to hear also,
Yeah.
which is, so set up for a question. The question is, would you say you're a giver or a receiver? Which do
I
you do
have a,
better? Do you give more or do you receive more?
I have a history. Transparency. You asked me to be transparent,
Good.
especially with the women in my life, of giving way more than I feel like I receive.
Fabulous. I would have guessed that, but I didn't want to assume it. I wanted to ask and
I'll
hear.
assume it. No, you
Okay.
can assume
Um,
it.
so one of the things, and by the way, transparency, I am too. I give so much to people, but I find it almost hard to receive sometimes. Um, and so the backdrop of what we've been talking about, put what almost like an overhead projector, like take what we've been talking about as the first sheet.
Are those a thing? Do they still
Well,
exist,
I don't
Danny?
know if they still exist. I'm dating myself. I
I don't
asked.
know. The overhead projector. I remember those from, I think, the third grade. Yeah.
Right. Okay. So for those people who are millennials or don't know what an overhead projector is, which I think you do, but they're projectors that you put a sheet of plastic. It's light on the bottom, and it has an arm that goes out and shows the picture onto a wall or onto a screen. So in those days, what we did is we would put sheets of plastic that would and we would draw on it, and then we would put another sheet of plastic on it, another sheet, and we would see how those images commingled together. Now, with that really elaborate description of an overhead projector,
Stone Age PowerPoint. That's all you need to know, right?
Stone Age PowerPoint. Um, take the conversation that we were having around the work that we do. Put onto it the conversation of whether we're givers or receivers.
Mm.
And let me try and re-ask my question again, because I didn't think I got really where I wanted to go.
Okay.
In a world where we are givers, what is what we give trying to give to us if we would only receive it?
Mm. A large portion of the work that I've done has a thread of community through it, over and over and over again in different ways. And as I mentioned, growing up, community was a challenge for me. You know, we were one of the only Jews in our neighborhood, and people painted swastikas on our house and Halloween, and, just whatever. But even at the Jewish, at the temple I grew up in,
Hold
yeah.
it. Time out for a minute, because there's been something that's been sitting with me since you said it, and that image, just like me being Jewish myself, I can't, I you said something, and I just saw a documentary called "Becoming" of Michelle Obama's book on Netflix. And one of the things she's talking about to the Black community is how she grew up on the South Side, and when they moved into a white neighborhood, and they experienced white flight, which you mentioned,
Yeah.
right? Which also just made me remember as a kid growing up in this little area in Philadelphia, and Black families coming in and us having white flight, and I felt like almost nauseous when she said it, because of how ashamed I was that was the reality. I mean, I grew up in a beautiful family, but how ashamed I was that was a component of my reality. And then the component of moving into an area where, like, you escaped the Black migration and went into this community that was supposed to be good and beautiful, and now they're painting swastikas on you because they don't accept you. And it's the same way that the white flight caused you to not accept the people, not you because you were a kid, right, but the family and the lineage. And it just, in the in the same paragraph as the sentence of community, I just want to ask the listeners to pause for a moment and ask themselves, like, what did they grow up with? What things were a part of their life
Mm.
that we don't even think about? Like, I remember coming home from school and my mom and saying to my mom, I was a chubby little kid, and I said, you know, there's some black kids in our school now, and it's so great. I love having them. They're fabulous athletes, and they're fast. Like they're way faster than I am. And she made something up. She wasn't a racist in my mind, but she planted a racist thought into my head that I didn't really remember wasn't true for another 10 or 15 years.
Mm.
She said, Danny, they have an extra bone in their ankle that makes them run quicker.
Mm.
Complete myth,
Mm.
right? But it's that type of thing that's just subplanted in without any, there was no malice in it. She was just trying to make me feel better for being a chubby little kid, but it just distorts my reality.
Mm.
I'm sorry, you were talking about community. It was burning up inside me. So I just wanted to.
Yeah. There's so many layers of where we miss, and difference gets in the way of deep connection. And yet, at least for this human, I can't speak for other humans. What I really long for is deep, authentic, diverse community. I'm wired for, it's one of the poignant experiences that this particular nervous system wants. And
Yeah.
I don't, mm, and I'll just stop there. I want it. I long for it. I didn't grow up with it. And I've worked really hard. I moved to New Mexico in 1993. I've been here longer than anywhere else in my life. And this is the highest proportion of people of color in the United States. It's this incredibly rich spiritual place. And again, I wanted to work in that kind of environment. And when I look at this community that I've told you about, Awarepreneurs, we have 300 plus members, and it's deep, and it's attention to social impact, and it's diverse. It's one of them I've worked really hard to try to make it a safe place. And I can't say everybody feels safe, but if you look at who's in that community, it's one of the more diverse in the conscious business and social entrepreneur space. So your question was, what do I get back? What was I looking for? And growing up the way I grew up, although it had great benefits and much privilege, what I missed is there were many ways it wasn't authentic, it wasn't warm, it wasn't diverse, and it didn't feed my heart and soul the way I'm wired.
Yeah.
And now I'm incredibly off the charts grateful to be in community that is deep, where people are authentic. It is diverse, and it feeds my particularly quirky, poignant nervous system unlike anything I've ever experienced.
Love that. With all that said, what about that community scares you?
What scares me? The power and the poignancy of the people. I'm used to having in monolithic communities, it's easy to be the person who's, especially because I live in New Mexico and there's a tradition of embodied, deep, dedicate your whole life to spirituality. People come to New Mexico. I've been to Santa Fe. Oh my God, Santa Fe. Oh my God, Taos. Oh my. There's a way people have lived here for 1,000+ years. Taos Pueblo is the oldest continually inhabited building in North America. And I've swam in those waters. So it's easy to kind of shine in certain communities where people haven't had the benefit of deep embodied spiritual practice. The quality of the leaders and the depth of practice, and because many of our members have practiced in diverse community, they're not as fragile as people who've lived in or practiced in very monolithic, same intellectually and how we think, we look the same, studied the same places. Those communities and people who grow up in them are more fragile. It's the same in business. If you don't have diversity in business, you tend to not do as well, just pure bottom line financially, as somebody, as a team that does have more diversity in all kinds. The modern Western US spiritual community is not very diverse. And it's easy for somebody who's practiced a long time to kind of be like, wow, that dude knows a lot. But in this community, my experience of having cultivated diversity and learned from out of the box, not who would necessarily show up as a Hay House author or on the front cover of Omega or Esalen, or where certain people look to where spiritual leadership comes from. Not that those aren't valid places, but if you're a person of color, that's not where you look for the most part. And those folks have had similar experiences to me of finding embodied teachers in embodied traditions in a way that most dominant culture spiritual people haven't had, and they have as much or more than I do. So it's like, oh wow, I'm being met here, which is my deepest longing. But it's also scary when you finally are like, whoa, here's a person of substance that has some reference point for what I'm talking about, instead of like, oh, you used to work on the Pueblos, oh my god, how the Pueblos are so amazing, what's it like?
Right. So I'm sorry, I'm going to ask you again. What?
There he goes, asking the question 2 or 3 times
I'm
to
sorry.
find the thing,
I'm
right?
sorry.
No, don't apologize. It's awesome.
So what actually scares you?
The quality of the leadership, the power of the people in the community.
And why does that scare you?
Marianne Williamson or Nelson Mandela, depend who you
Quote, believe the quote book says. But both,
exactly, right?
Right.
Our deepest fear is not that you don't have power, but that you have power beyond measure.
So I'm going to ask you one more time, because that's what they said.
That power is both what I long for and it scares me.
Okay. I'm going to try and give a personal experience and see if this is sort of what you're trying to say, because I like, you speak well, but I almost missed it. So not because it's not because of you, but because of me. I'm a very simple mind person. There have been a couple of times, maybe a few times in my life, where through the practice of meditation, something has happened for me. And that I actually lost consciousness with maintaining this being. And I connected to the place where there is no separation. There is no, in the mosaic, I talk about it. I talk about it in Meeting the Wise One and the experience that he gave me, which was of the mosaic completely whole with no broken pieces. It is everything that I ever prayed for. It's everything I've ever wanted. And in those moments, 2 times for sure, one time I think I went with it and just came out of it naturally. But in 2 of the 3 times, I was scared to death. And I remember my wife was away visiting her family with the kids. And I thought, okay, she could come home and find me just dead on the floor. Like, I don't know what's going to be the reality if I walk through this door, even though it's the door that I've always wanted to walk through. Is that the same sort of sense of power and fear that you feel? Does that come close to resonating with what you're saying?
Oh, definitely. Here's a simple way to say it. In the indigenous tradition and the native tradition in New Mexico, the circle is sacred. There's nothing more sacred than a circle. Nothing. And I didn't grow up that way.
Yeah.
So I've been working towards learning how to do that and get better at it I'm 52, at least 51 and a half years, a long time, right? but I grew up in a culture that was incredibly hierarchical and dominance. To sit in a circle with people who know how to sit in a circle and really practice it well and are better at it than I am, that's all I've ever wanted. And it's really, on a cellular level, asks me to change in a way that I thought I had already done a lot of work on, and I have.
Yeah.
But it shows me where I'm incomplete and where I still have the residue of growing up in a culture that is really bad at it.
Yeah. Yeah. I don't know that it's like I would reframe it for my listeners or for me. I hope you got your listeners, you reframe it or hear it the way you want to hear it. I don't think that anything is that people are really bad at it. I just don't think that we know it. I think we've grown up in a vertical reality where we're used to having people lead us, and a
Absolutely.
horizontal reality of a circle or mosaic, which is one of the things that I'm trying to bring into the world. I love what you're saying because I'm going to now try and be a part of more indigenous cultures who use circle,
Mm.
because I literally, mosaic is everything is horizontal.
Mm.
There's nobody teaching anybody in mosaic. There's just the idea of coming together and sharing and being with each other. We become stronger. United we stand, divided we fall. It's what we all grew up saying. So I love that. We sort of touched on it, but it's where I go when I close. So I'm happy you didn't complete it when you touched on it, which is the only question I ever always ask is, when you look out the window at the world that you see, is it the world you've always dreamed of handing over to your children and your children's children?
It's a great question. Somebody wise told me that the honest answer to every spiritual deep question is it depends.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Okay.
When I look out my window, literally, there's this beautiful fig tree, and this year it's particularly gorgeous green, big leaves, and there's figs on it. And I live in this sweet little complex where I know my neighbors and we're gardening together. And um, my daughter knows what I do for work and appreciates it, and we talk about it, and I know what she's doing with her life. Um, and the external, like, what are we literally handing over? No, I'm horrified. I'm horrified at the messes we've made and the inequalities we've created and what happens in the estimation of people that I consider to be really wise and that I trust. And if we stay on the path we're on, it's a nightmare of a world we're passing on to our children and grandchildren.
So I love your dependable statements and both sides of it. Um, so in the world that is the nightmare that you see, what would be something that you could suggest people do today and continue to do on a daily basis that would allow them to, because we know if we keep going that way, it's going to just keep going that way. That's not rocket science. So what would be one disruption that we could give, or one upliftment that we could offer, that would lean the world more towards the fig tree that
Mm,
you see out your window, that is beautiful and untouched by all the tragedy of the world around it?
mm. When I reinvented myself after 15 years of community mental health and community work, which was beautiful work, but I was tired and burned out. I was part of the reason as I unpacked why I was so tired. I was working in community centered, mostly nonprofit structures, and the money, the horsepower was in business. It felt like we were always kind of begging for scraps. Please
Yeah.
give us some breadcrumbs so we can keep these families alive, or like try to work on intergenerational violence, or do something about substance abuse that's having incredible impact on certain communities in New Mexico or whatever. And I decided to go where the horsepower was. And it was a combination of the spiritual teachers. Spiritual teachers across different denominations that I trusted were all saying one very similar thing. The single most powerful and precious resource we have is human attention.
Hmm.
And in a modern economy, we work more than any other, just simple math. We work, I love my daughter. I have awesome friends. I love meditation. I play music. I love to cook. I garden. I work more than any of those things.
Yeah.
And I work less than most Americans,
Yeah.
just on a weekly basis. So the concentration of what we do for work is the highest concentration, just sheer numbers, in a week. And if that's aligned with our values, then that's where the horsepower is. There's a lot of horsepower there. And if somebody's like saying, I don't know what to do, and sorry, Monsanto, I'm going to pick on, if you're an executive in Monsanto and you're saying, I want to make the world a better place,
Yeah.
well, you're spending the majority of your time at Monsanto. I don't know what to tell you. Give some
Right.
money to charity, but maybe reconsider what you do for work.
Right. So your advice would be, in one sentence?
Look to make your work, align your work with your values.
Perfect. Perfect. Paul, if people want to get in touch with you, what would be, we're going to list all the multiple of, URLs, but tell them what's the best way to get in touch with you.
Go to Awarepreneurs, the first part of the word awareness and the second part of the word entrepreneurs, awarepreneurs.com.
And the spelling of that's going to be in the show notes. You're going to see it along with his other listings. Paul, thank you for coming. I know you have a hard stop. I'm going to allow you to jump off. Normally I have you stay for the summary that I have, but I know you have a hard stop. Why don't you pop off? And I want to thank you from the bottom of my heart for being with us. For those people, I'm going to stay on and just summarize what my thoughts were on this whole thing. So
thank you so much for what you do, Danny, and for having me on the show. I really appreciate it.
It's my absolute honor. Hopefully it's the beginning of something, not the end, brother.
I look forward to it.
Enjoy.
All right.
Ciao.
Take care.
So I just wanted to take a moment and summarize, like I do every Mosaic podcast. There were so many moments in that conversation that I would really like you to have with yourself. How are some of the thoughts that we grew up with, the thoughts that we had? One of the things that, I highlighted in that conversation was the sense of this feeling that their family left the area they were in because of white flight, because blacks were moving in. My family did the same thing. And we weren't a well-to-do family. We were a lower middle-class family. But the words were exactly what I heard in the Becoming documentary made around Michelle Obama's life on Netflix yesterday. I listened to it. That people were told they better sell their houses fast when the blacks came in because they were going to lose value. How outrageous. And yet those thoughts were so strongly put into our being. And then we talk about creating communities of diversity. I know I, for one, from this conversation, want to, and from the Michelle Obama documentary, Becoming, I really have been taking a look at what that white flight, if there's any place that exists in me. Is there any place that exists in me that says white supremacy is good or bad? Is there any place that exists in me that says Democrat or Republican is good or bad? Is there any place within me that says Donald Trump is good or bad? Because I think in the essence of creating community, unless we want it to be everybody is a complete replication of what we believe and think, it's going to be a boring community. The beauty of diversity within community is it allows us to experience innovation. It allows us to see things differently, to feel things differently, to come at different perspectives, to hear about the way someone grew up and the way their lives have changed as a result of what they've done. I'd like to ask you to look at some of your belief systems. And are there any little threads that still exist from belief systems that you used to have that you don't want to have anymore? I also want to ask you, how aligned are you to your purpose? How aligned is your spirituality and your work? Is this something that you value? Do you wake up to do your work as if it was the most enjoyable, fun thing you could ever do? Or do you wake up and think, oh, 40 more hours and I get to celebrate because I can come home for the weekend? Take a listen back and just listen to some of the conversations. The beauty of this podcast is we don't just ask the same questions everybody else asks. And in not asking those questions, we find different answers. So I'm asking you, what are your answers? Thank you again for joining us. Thank you for the gift of your time and your presence. If you like these podcasts, please share them with your friend. Tell people about them. We're trying to grow its presence because we're doing something really good right now. And we want more people to know it, not so that we have more notoriety, just because I think it's a valuable way for people to get information. So like us on Apple Podcast, write a review if you can. And let me hear from you. Tell me what you'd like to hear. Tell me what you want. Tell me what's missing. Tell me what questions you would like to have answered. Thank you again for the most valuable gift you could ever give me, your time. Until next podcast, be happy.